had planned to stop by the small gift shop on Main Street after work, a place I'd passed countless times, but never actually entered. It was Valentine's Day, and I wanted something thoughtful for my best friend, someone who had been my anchor for years. The street was quiet that evening, the sun gone and the dim glow of the streetlights reflecting off the damp asphalt from an earlier rain. The town had a slow, almost sleepy rhythm, and I liked that about it. It made even errands like this feel calm, almost ordinary. I pushed open the door to the shop, the bell above it chiming softly. Inside, the smell of wax and paper mingled with something faintly sweet, like old sugar and polish. The room was small, the walls lined with shelves crammed with trinkets, boxes of chocolates, plush toys, and cards arranged in orderly rows. The light was warm and slightly yellow, flickering in places as if the bulbs had been there for decades. I walked along the aisles, scanning the shelves. The store was nearly empty, save for a woman behind the counter, her eyes focused on a register screen, and me. My attention fell on the cards. I liked finding ones that felt personal without being cheesy. I picked up a few, flipping them over in my hands. The paper had a slight texture, and the ink smelled faintly of ink and something floral. I wasn't in any rush. I had the quiet pleasure of just browsing. The walls were covered in heart-shaped decorations, some glittering, some muted, all carefully arranged. The hum of the heat from the old radiators mixed with the faint rustle of paper as I moved, a soft rhythm in the otherwise still room. It started with the sense of being watched. At first, I thought it was just me imagining it, the way I sometimes felt in small spaces where the light shifted and shadows lingered longer than they should. But when I turned slightly, I noticed him. A man standing a few feet behind me, leaning against a shelf with a posture that didn't quite match the relaxed setting. He wasn't browsing. He was watching. I looked down at the cards in my hand, pretending not to notice, telling myself it was probably nothing. I tried to focus on the lines of text, the small illustrations, but the awareness of him persisted. There was something in the way his smile stretched across his face, too wide, too practiced, holding in it a kind of tension that made my stomach tighten. I moved along the aisle, picking up a small box of chocolates, and he shifted too, closing the gap just slightly. Not enough to be obvious, but enough that I noticed. I felt my shoulders tense and started backing toward the door, telling myself I could leave, that it was fine. The air felt heavier, the warmth of the shop now tinged with unease. My pulse was faster, but I kept my movements deliberate, casual. I tried to pretend I hadn't seen him, that my focus on the gifts was complete. I felt his presence pressing against the edges of my awareness, and it was disorienting, as though the room had contracted around him without my noticing. I passed by a rack of plush animals, their small eyes staring up at me as I moved. The man's gaze was sharper now, tracking me. I could feel it, a steady weight behind my shoulder blades that made the hair on my neck rise. My fingers tightened around the chocolate box, and I realized I was holding my breath. The aisle was narrow, and the sound of our steps against the worn floorboards echoed softly. I felt trapped, though there was no lock, no barrier, only the sense that turning too quickly or moving the wrong way might trigger something I couldn't control. I told myself to stay calm, to act normal, but every instinct in me screamed that this was wrong, that I shouldn't be here, that he shouldn't be here. I edged toward the front of the store, closer to the door, and the man moved as well. Not directly behind me, not aggressively, but enough that every shift he made mirrored mine, like a shadow with its own intent. The light from the street outside spilled in through the glass, and I saw the rain droplets clinging to the window, catching the glow of the street lamps. I considered leaving immediately, paying for the gift or not, just stepping out and never looking back. But the register was still occupied with the cashier, who hadn't looked up from her screen, oblivious to the tension that had built like static electricity in the small space. I tried to distract myself, examining a card with delicate lettering, the kind of one you would send to someone who mattered to you. But as I read the words, I became aware that he was closer now, his gaze steady and unyielding. There was no reason for it, no excuse, only the discomfort of being watched and the strange, personal feel of his attention. I could feel my chest tighten, my stomach twisting. Every instinct was telling me to move, to get out, but I forced myself to act natural, to linger just a moment longer, hoping he would eventually lose interest. When I stepped toward the door, my hand on the handle, I glanced back slightly. The man was still there, but when I blinked, he seemed farther away, as if he had retreated into the shadows of the store. I pushed the door open and stepped outside, the chill of the February night hitting me immediately. The damp air smelled faintly of wet asphalt and frost, and my coat felt suddenly too thin. I glanced around the sidewalk and the street, expecting to see him. He was gone. Relief washed over me, slow and trembling. I took a breath, a long exhale, convincing myself it was over. Then, as I stepped down, I noticed something at my feet. A card. The paper was different from the ones I had been handling inside. It was folded, worn along the edges as if it had been carried in a pocket or a bag for a while. I bent down and picked it up, my fingers brushing against the surface, cold and rough. My name was written across the front in shaky handwriting, uneven, the ink smudged in places. I opened it carefully, my hands trembling despite my attempts to stay composed. Inside, a short note. I saw everything. Next year, you won't escape. The words were simple, yet the meaning was clear. The casual tone of the script contrasted sharply with the threat behind it, and my stomach dropped. I felt the night close in, the quiet of the street now oppressive. I dropped the card into my pocket and hurried down the sidewalk, my steps quick, uneven. The streetlights flickered intermittently, as if in warning, and the houses lining the street were dark and silent. My mind raced, cataloging every detail of the encounter, the shop, the man's smile, the way he followed without speaking, the precise handwriting of the card. I told myself I had done nothing wrong, that there was no rational reason for someone to target me, yet the sense of danger was undeniable. I passed the last intersection before my apartment and looked back once, half expecting to see him emerging from the shadows. There was nothing but the empty street, wet and glistening under the street lamps. I never returned to that shop. I avoided that block entirely for months, taking different routes and leaving errands for other days, convincing myself that it had been a one-time occurrence, that the randomness of it would protect me. Yet every Valentine's Day after that, I felt the same prickling unease, an almost tangible weight in the back of my mind. I made sure to leave early from work, to stay aware of my surroundings, and to never linger in small spaces where someone could observe me without being noticed. The memory of the man, the quiet menace of his presence, and the card waiting for me outside stayed with me longer than I thought possible, a lesson in vigilance and the thin line between normality and threat. Months later, I learned from a local paper that there had been reports of similar behavior in nearby towns, a man approaching women in quiet stores, asking personal questions, leaving notes. The pattern confirmed the worst of my instincts. It wasn't supernatural, it wasn't unexplainable, it was deliberate, human, and entirely preventable if recognized early. I felt a cold relief in knowing I hadn't imagined it, that my instincts had been right, but also a lingering fear that the next time, the circumstances might be different. I never went back to that gift shop. I didn't want to see the aisles, the decorations, the space where a stranger had crossed the line into my life. I kept the card, tucked away in a drawer, a reminder of how carefully normal life could shift, how quickly a quiet evening could become a memory of fear. I had spent the entire day preparing. The city was cold, the wind sharper than I expected for February, and the sun had set hours ago, leaving the streets in a pale orange haze from the streetlights and the occasional glare of passing cars. I carried the candles up the narrow stairwell of the building, the smell of melted wax lingering faintly on my gloves. Each step creaked under my weight, the sound echoing off the concrete walls, small enough that it might have been swallowed by the hum of the city outside, but loud in the silence I felt pressing against me. I reached the roof and paused, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness and the glow of the skyline. The familiar outline of the Willis Tower rose above the horizon, its lights like distant stars, and I felt a flicker of excitement mixed with the nervous tension in my stomach. This was supposed to be a simple, quiet gesture. Candles lined up in a heart shape, the city below, a moment that would feel removed from everything else for her. I set the first candle down, careful to make it steady despite the wind that tugged at my coat. Each flame took longer than I expected to catch, sputtering and wavering, and I adjusted their positions one by one, crouching low so my fingers weren't scorched. The smell of melted wax grew stronger as I worked, mingling with the cold scent of the city, and the small sounds, the faint whistle of wind, the occasional distant car horn, the rustle of a pigeon taking flight from a nearby ledge, became the background of the moment. My heart was racing, partly from anticipation, partly from the climb up the stairs, partly from the effort of arranging everything perfectly in the uneven light. I stood back and looked at what I had made. The heart of candles glowed unevenly but warmly, flickering against the steel rails and concrete ledge. The skyline felt alive, the lights of apartments and offices in the distance reminding me of the countless people unaware of this small, deliberate space on the roof where I had paused my life. That's when I heard it. A scraping, faint but unmistakable, near the stairwell entrance at the far corner of the roof. I froze, holding my breath, trying to convince myself it was just the wind, a shifting piece of metal, a branch from a rooftop plant box brushing against the wall. The sound came again, deliberate this time, slow and soft but distinct against the occasional hum of the city. I tried to ignore it, telling myself someone else must have made it, maybe maintenance or a tenant checking on the roof. I stayed crouched for a moment, listening. My chest was tight, my ears straining to pick up anything beyond the scrape. Then the figure emerged. He was thin, taller than I expected, dressed in black, blending into the shadows, holding something long and narrow that caught the faint reflection of the city lights. A knife, or maybe a metal rod, I couldn't tell at first. My stomach dropped. Every instinct screamed to move, to run, but the legs froze under me. The roof felt smaller all at once, the concrete more slippery, the edge of the building closer than I remembered. I realized he had been watching me while I set the candles. I hadn't heard him climb or even move beyond that scraping, but now he was there, silent except for the slow, deliberate steps he took toward me. The wind seemed to pick up around him, tugging at his coat and sending a candle flickering wildly, but he didn't falter. I turned, weighing the narrow options. The stairwell was behind me, the edge of the roof to my left, the candles between us. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I realized there was no room for negotiation, no chance to stand and reason. Every step I took toward the fire escape felt slow, but every step had to be measured so I didn't trip on the concrete or the candles. He mirrored my movement, his steps silent until I thought I could hear the faintest scrape again. I focused on the narrow metal ladder, cold and slick under my gloves. My hands gripped it, and the metal shivered under my weight. I climbed down quickly, almost falling once, my shoes slipping against the rungs. My breathing came in short, sharp bursts, and I could hear him moving above me, not fast, not chasing, but present, tracking, a shadow above the glow of the city lights. I reached the lower platform, swung my leg over, and dropped onto the next landing. My heart was in my throat, my fingers numb, but I forced myself to keep moving. Each rung was a small eternity. When I hit the ground, my boots scuffed against the concrete roof of the building below, and I didn't stop. I ran along the narrow ledge, then to the fire escape that led to the street, feeling the metal cold against my hands, every step loud in the quiet night. Behind me, I could sense the figure still standing on the roof above, motionless now, but watching. I didn't look back. My breath came in ragged gasps, burning my chest, the fear pressing down with every step. When I reached the street, the roar of distant traffic became a sort of safety, masking everything else. I didn't stop until I was halfway down the block, my legs shaking from adrenaline and cold. The streetlights cast long shadows, and I kept scanning them, expecting him to step out from somewhere, but he never did. The candles were left behind, small flames sputtering in the wind, a half-finished scene of something that was meant to be beautiful. I never went back to the roof. I never knew exactly who he was, why he had been there, why he couldn't let it be. I reported it to the police, but they found nothing, no footprints, no one around the building, just the faint smell of wax in the wind. For years afterward, the memory haunted me. Every time I walked past rooftops, every time I climbed stairs in a quiet building, my mind replayed those steps, that thin figure in black, the scraping, the slow approach. I pictured the edge of the roof, the flickering flames, and the cold metal under my fingers. It changed the way I moved in the city, the way I approached quiet, elevated spaces. I could never return to that kind of vulnerability, to thinking that a simple gesture could exist without risk. Over time, I understood that the fear wasn't just about that night. It was about how quickly ordinary things could turn dangerous, how close proximity could become a threat without warning. I stopped planning grand gestures, stopped thinking that city lights and candles could hide me from the world's unpredictability. But I also carried a sense of survival, a clarity about movement, awareness, and vigilance. I can still see the roof from certain streets, the faint outline of the stairwell, the skyline glowing, and I remember the figure, thin and quiet, standing in the shadows, and I know that night taught me something I couldn't unlearn. It was a lesson in fear, but also in the precision of escape, in noticing the details that matter, in understanding that sometimes the smallest sounds, the faintest scrapes, mean everything. I parked on the street in front of his house, the tires crunching softly in the thin layer of snow that had fallen earlier that evening. The streetlights cast a pale, yellow glow on the icy sidewalks, reflecting off the bare branches that reached toward the sky like twisted fingers. I sat in the car for a moment, staring at the house, trying to convince myself that it was normal to return the small teddy bear he had left at my apartment weeks ago. I told myself it was closure, simple and practical. Nothing more. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel, cold despite the heater running. I opened the door and stepped onto the snow-covered sidewalk. My boots sank slightly, leaving deep impressions that disappeared quickly under the light dusting of fresh snow. I carried the bear in my hand, gripping it like a fragile, unnecessary weight. Each step toward the front door made me more aware of the quiet around me. The street was empty, silent except for the distant hum of traffic from a main road a few blocks away and the occasional squeak of metal in the cold. My breath puffed in small clouds, visible in the faint light, each exhale sounding louder than it should in the stillness of the night. When I reached the door, I froze. Fresh footprints surrounded my car, larger than mine and not entirely straight. They looped around the side and stretched closer to the walkway. I hadn't noticed them on the way in, but now they were impossible to ignore. They seemed almost deliberate, as if someone had moved with purpose, tracing a path just out of my line of sight. My stomach tightened, a mix of panic and disbelief. I told myself it was probably a neighbor or someone passing by. Rational thoughts fought with the rising tension in my chest. I rang the doorbell. The chime echoed through the cold night, a small, brittle sound swallowed quickly by the quiet. Nothing. I pressed it again, harder this time, waiting for a sound from inside, any sign of movement. The snow beneath my boots shifted slightly as I shifted my weight, scanning the house. The front windows were dark, the curtains drawn tight, except for one on the second floor. It moved, slowly, just enough to catch my attention. A window slid open, and a thin figure appeared for a moment, barely visible. The glass above my head tapped. One tap, then another, measured and deliberate. My heart jumped, loud and erratic. I didn't move, frozen where I stood, hand clutching the bear. The tapping continued, rhythmic now, almost mocking. I realized then that my own footsteps on the walkway hadn't made nearly as much sound, but this tapping was different. Controlled. Waiting. I stepped back, the snow crunching under my boots far too loudly in the tense silence. I could feel eyes on me, though I didn't dare look directly at the window. My hand trembled as I gripped the bear tighter, the fur rough against my palm. Then I heard it, low and deliberate, the words unmistakable, even though the distance made them sound strange. "I'm glad you came back." Not shouted, not desperate, just calm, precise. It went straight through me. I turned and ran. My boots skidded slightly on the ice, and my body moved faster than my mind wanted. My chest burned, and my breath came in ragged, visible bursts as the cold air filled my lungs. I reached my car, fumbling with the keys, fingers numb and clumsy. The footprints were still there, circling the car as though nothing had changed, though I had been the only one moving. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I pressed the key fob, and the locks clicked. Sliding in, I locked the doors behind me and tried to calm the thundering of my heart. I looked out the windshield, but the house was dark again, the window closed. No one visible, no figure, just the quiet suburban street and the fresh, untouched snow. I stayed in the car for a long time, just sitting, shaking, trying to convince myself it was all in my mind. Rationally, I knew someone could have been hiding nearby, watching, waiting. Every shadow in the dim streetlight felt deliberate, every crackle of ice underfoot a threat. I couldn't stop scanning, couldn't stop thinking about the tap on the glass, the calm voice, the way they had known exactly when I would return. The bear, so small and insignificant in my hand, suddenly felt like a signal, a marker of my movements that had been tracked and anticipated. Eventually, I started the car. The engine's hum filled the interior, but it did little to calm me. I drove slowly at first, eyes darting to the windows of houses as I passed, imagining someone watching from behind the curtains. The snow had started to drift more heavily, coating the street in white, but it didn't erase the sense of being observed. Every driveway I passed felt like a potential hiding spot. Every shadowed corner seemed alive with intent. I realized I had been watched for weeks, the realization cutting deeper than the cold. The bear had been a lure, or maybe a simple pretense to make me come back. I remembered leaving my apartment that morning, feeling the ordinary stress of a normal day, never imagining someone had been paying close attention to my routine. The thought made the hairs on my arms rise, my stomach churn with a cold, sinking fear. Whoever it was had planned this moment, calculated it, and now they had proof that I would comply, that I would return exactly as they expected. I parked outside a 24-hour diner a few blocks away, pretending to stop for coffee, pretending to regain some control. My hands still shook as I held the steering wheel, the bear resting on the passenger seat beside me. I didn't want to go home yet, didn't want to be alone in my apartment, didn't want to let the quiet of my own space remind me that I had been tracked. Every reflective surface in the diner, every window facing the dark street, seemed like a possible surveillance point. I stayed for an hour, just watching the street, waiting for something that never came. Eventually, I forced myself to drive home. I checked my rearview mirror constantly, imagining movement behind me. The streets were empty, the snow masking tire tracks, erasing evidence. My apartment building appeared in the distance, ordinary and silent. I parked, grabbed the bear, and unlocked my door. I didn't look outside again. I bolted the door, double-checked the locks, and pressed my back against it, shivering, exhausted from the adrenaline. That night, I barely slept. Every sound, the hum of the heater, the creak of the floorboards, the distant car outside, set my nerves on edge. I imagined someone outside my window, watching, tapping, waiting. I realized then that the house on my street, the suburban normality I had taken for granted, could hold someone who had been tracking me, waiting for the precise moment I returned a forgotten gift. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't fluke, it was methodical, deliberate. I finally understood that it had been a test, and I had passed it simply by existing, by moving through my ordinary life in the way I always had. The bear stayed in my apartment for weeks. I couldn't get rid of it, couldn't throw it away. It was a reminder, a silent witness to the night I had been followed, to the quiet terror of someone knowing my patterns, my movements, my fears. I eventually wrapped it in a box, hidden in the back of my closet, out of sight but never out of mind. I changed routines, avoided that street, watched my surroundings more carefully. The sense of being observed never fully left me. Even now, years later, the memory is vivid, as precise and calculated as the tapping on that window, as exact as the voice that welcomed me back. I learned that night that danger can be ordinary, can wear the face of someone you once trusted, and that ordinary gestures, a returned gift, a step on a snowy sidewalk, can be all it takes to reveal a person's hidden intent. I needed to be alone. The breakup had left a weight in my chest, a dull, persistent ache I couldn't shake. My apartment felt smaller than usual, the walls pressing in, memories of him scattered across every surface. I needed a space that felt removed from the noise of the city, somewhere I could think without interruption. Fairmount Park came to mind, not the crowded parts near the river, but the older, quieter sections that most people didn't bother with. I remembered reading about a stone bridge somewhere in the back of the park, a place where people left letters, notes of love and longing tucked into the cracks of the stones. The idea of it drew me there, almost like a ritual. I needed that, a place that felt charged with something human, something real, even if it was someone else's pain. The sky had already darkened when I arrived, the winter evening pressing against me with cold. Streetlights from the nearby streets gave way to lamplights in the park, faint and inconsistent, flickering through the bare branches. Snow had started earlier in the day, leaving only a thin dusting that softened the outlines of the path. My boots crunched faintly, muffled by the layer of powder. The air smelled of wet leaves and frozen earth, the kind of smell that makes your lungs tighten and your skin prickle. I moved slowly, the park eerily quiet except for the occasional rustle of a bird or the groan of a tree bending in the wind. I followed a narrow trail I barely recognized, twisting and turning between dense clumps of trees. The lamps were spaced unevenly, leaving pockets of darkness that swallowed the path. I felt exposed and aware of every sound, the snap of a twig underfoot, the faint rush of air as it shifted between the trees. My fingers were cold against my coat, and I pulled it tighter around myself, the fabric rough against my skin. I imagined the letters tucked into the bridge waiting, the layers of someone's private thoughts left for strangers to stumble upon. When I finally saw it, the stone bridge appeared like it had been waiting for me. The arch was low, worn smooth in places where hands had brushed it over years, and the parapets were lined with yellowed papers, pinned and folded, tucked into cracks and gaps. The sight of them was both comforting and unnerving. Each paper seemed like a fragment of someone's life, a moment of desperation, longing, or guilt made tangible. I stopped at the edge of the bridge and let my eyes drift across the scattered notes, the snow swirling around them, some half buried. I picked up one that had slid to the ground. The paper was brittle, edges curled and soft with age. The handwriting was tight and rushed, almost frantic. As I read, my chest tightened. The words were personal, angry in a way that disguised itself as passion. Promises of love twisted into threats, affection laced with warnings. "If you leave me, you'll regret it forever," it read, and my stomach flipped. I glanced up, suddenly aware of how quiet it had become. The air felt heavier, almost pressed against my skin. I felt it before I saw it, the sense that I wasn't alone. Something shifted behind me, subtle but unmistakable. I froze, my hands tightening on the paper, my breath catching in my throat. I turned slowly, expecting to see a figure emerge from the shadows. There was nothing. The path behind me was empty, the trees swaying in the wind, snow drifting down in thin, ghostly ribbons. Yet I felt it, the heat of eyes on the back of my neck, the slow, deliberate awareness that someone had noticed me. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was the park, the isolation, the way the darkness could play tricks. But the feeling didn't leave. My pulse had sped, my hands trembling as I tucked the note into my coat pocket. I took a step back, then another, my boots skidding on the thin layer of ice that had formed on the bridge. The sound of paper shifting beneath me made me flinch. I didn't want to stay, didn't want to test whether this was real or imagined. I turned and started to walk, carefully, along the path that led away from the bridge. My eyes darted to every shadow, every flicker of movement between the trees. I slipped once, almost falling, catching myself on a frozen branch. The papers on the bridge fluttered in the wind, making soft, dry noises that sounded like whispers, like fragments of conversations I wasn't meant to hear. I could feel my own heartbeat in my ears, a relentless drum that made every sound around me sharper, more alarming. The walk back to the main road felt longer than it should have. The darkness seemed to stretch, the lamps spaced too far apart, their weak glow barely keeping the shadows at bay. I moved faster, boots sliding over ice, lungs burning from the cold. Every now and then, I caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow that didn't match the trees, a shift too deliberate to be the wind. I didn't stop to look. I didn't turn my head. I just kept walking, feeling the weight of that letter in my pocket, the words still pressing against my chest. When I finally reached the streetlights near the edge of the park, I paused, trying to steady myself. I scanned the darkness behind me, but there was nothing, just trees, just the quiet snow, just the park continuing as if nothing had happened. I felt exposed now, aware of the vulnerability of the city's outskirts at night, the way a small misstep could make me visible, unprotected. My hands were numb, my cheeks burning from the cold, my stomach still tight with fear. I walked the last few blocks to my apartment without incident, but the unease didn't fade. I kept thinking about the letter, the deliberate tension in its words, the way it had made the hair on my arms stand up. I thought about the bridge, about the notes left there, about the people who had written them, and the people who had found them. The idea that someone had been watching, someone who might have been lurking behind me as I read it, made the night stretch in my mind for days afterward. A week later, I saw the news report. The bridge had been cordoned off. A woman had reported being followed by a man, someone who claimed he was protecting true love. Police had found him in the area, a man who had left dozens of letters, carefully hidden, watching, waiting. He had a record, they said, but nothing recent, nothing that had prepared anyone for this level of obsession. I recognized the handwriting in one of the photos of the letters. They matched the ones I had seen. I felt a chill, knowing I had been there alone, and had seen the same signs without realizing how close I might have been. I stopped going to the park after that. I avoided the sections that were quiet, the paths that cut deep into the old trees. But I couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't stop remembering the letters, the brittle paper in my hands, the sensation of being watched in the quiet dark. The memory of the bridge stayed with me, not just because of the fear, but because of how real it had been, how close I had come to a danger that existed in the world, in ordinary people, in ordinary obsession. I learned to recognize the signs after that, small cues that someone's attention is more than casual, more than polite curiosity. The letters, the bridge, the winter night, all of it stayed with me as a warning, a reminder that human obsession could be as cold, as precise, and as inescapable as the winter darkness. And though I never returned, I understood why the bridge had been a place for these letters. It offered the illusion of safety, the isolation to think, to love, to threaten without consequence. It was human, ordinary, and terrifyingly real. I had spent the whole day trying to shake off the nervous energy in my chest. It was Valentine's Day, something I usually ignored. But this year I had convinced myself to try a dating app. It felt like the simplest way to meet someone without the awkwardness of bars or forced social situations. She seemed normal online, photos of her smiling, a few candid shots with friends, nothing that raised flags. Her messages were light but intelligent, funny in small doses, and she had a way of making me feel like she understood the small things about me. I told myself I was just being cautious. After all, meeting someone in public seemed safe enough. The restaurant was a small Italian place tucked between two apartment buildings. Its brick exterior looked warm, inviting, and the soft glow of the lights spilling onto the sidewalk created the kind of atmosphere that made the cold February evening feel less harsh. I arrived early, nervously twisting my hands in my coat pockets. When she arrived, she smiled, and for a moment I felt relief. She was exactly how she appeared in photos, maybe even warmer in person. Inside, the place smelled like garlic and toasted bread. The low hum of other diners created a sense of intimacy without being suffocating. We were seated near the corner, close enough to the window to watch the streetlights flicker against the wet pavement outside. We ordered drinks and then food. I tried to focus on the conversation, making small jokes, noticing the way she laughed at the right moments. She was polished, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in the ordinary details I shared about my life. I could feel the tension in my chest slowly ease, replaced by a quiet curiosity. Dessert came, a shared tiramisu, and it was when our hands brushed reaching for the same spoon that I felt a small thrill of connection. For a while, nothing seemed unusual. She was charming, well-mannered, and everything about her presence suggested normalcy. I told myself this was what a Valentine's date was supposed to feel like: safe light, a shared moment of warmth in the middle of winter. After paying, she insisted on walking me back to my car. At first, it felt fine. The streets were quiet, mostly empty, and I told myself that the proximity of buildings and occasional streetlights offered enough safety. She walked just a step ahead, and I followed, feeling a strange mix of comfort and unease. It was subtle at first, a slight tension in my stomach that I tried to ignore. The route she chose didn't match the path I knew from the restaurant to my parking garage. Instead, she led me down narrower streets, past alleys I didn't recognize. The streetlights became sporadic, flickering, casting shadows that seemed longer than they should have been. My heart began to pick up speed, and I forced myself to slow my breathing, to act casual, to remind myself that nothing about this was unusual. People take different paths. Maybe she lived nearby. I tried to focus on the details: the worn brick walls, the small cafe that had closed for the night, the occasional trash bin knocked askew by the wind. But my eyes kept flicking to her. She wasn't talking much now, and the smile that had seemed so warm at dinner felt slightly rigid. She paused in front of a narrow doorway, tucked into a shadowed corner. She pulled out a small key from her coat pocket and held it in her hand as if it were the most natural thing. She said she lived just upstairs, that I should come in for a nightcap. I felt my chest tighten. My mind screamed warning signals I hadn't felt before. Something was off. Every story I'd heard about dating apps, about men disappearing after meeting women in public spaces, surged into my thoughts. I refused. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The warmth of her smile dimmed, replaced by something colder, sharper. She tilted her head, her eyes hardening in a way that made my stomach sink. For a moment, it felt like time slowed. The street felt smaller, narrower, and the shadows deeper. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. She didn't push, but the way she held herself, the intensity in her gaze, suggested she had no intention of letting me walk away easily. I stepped back and reached for my car keys in my pocket. She moved slightly closer, just enough to make my skin crawl. That was all I needed. My legs moved without conscious thought, my hands gripping my keys so tightly that my knuckles whitened. I didn't look back. The few steps to my car felt endless. Her presence lingered behind me like a pressure on my shoulders. When I reached the vehicle, I fumbled with the door, my hands shaking. She stopped just a few feet away, and I caught the edge of her lips twisting into a small, knowing smile. She whispered something low and deliberate that made my blood run cold. I didn't respond. I slammed the door, started the engine, and drove off, the tires crunching over the icy patches of the street. My heart was hammering, my hands slick with sweat, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her following. I didn't stop until I was back on a main road, the glow of the city stretching before me. Only then did I allow myself to breathe normally. I parked in a well-lit area, staying in the car for a long time, just letting the adrenaline drain. The quiet hum of traffic and the distant sirens became a kind of reassurance, a reminder that I was still somewhere public, somewhere alive. The next day, I couldn't shake the image of her smile, the way her eyes had darkened. Something about it had been deliberate, calculated. I reported the encounter to the police, providing descriptions, screenshots of her profile, and the route we had taken. They confirmed my fears. She had a history of luring men from dating apps, men who had gone missing for hours or days at a time. Nothing violent had been officially confirmed, but the pattern was enough to make the chill in my spine return. The realization that I had been lucky, that I had noticed the small warning signs before it was too late, lingered for weeks. I replayed the walk in my mind, the narrow streets, the silent alleys, the moment she produced the key. Every detail that had seemed innocuous suddenly became significant. I never returned to that part of the city alone, and I deleted the dating app entirely, convincing myself that some connections simply weren't worth the risk. Even months later, on quiet evenings, I would think back to that night. The low hum of city lights through my window, the distant sounds of traffic, the faint reflection of streetlights on wet pavement. It felt like I had glimpsed something darker than I was ready to understand, and yet it was completely real, grounded, human. The fear hadn't been from monsters or ghosts. It had been from someone who seemed normal until she wasn't. Someone who could be anywhere, blending into the crowd, patient and watchful. I had escaped, but only because I trusted my instincts, only because I acted before hesitation could trap me. The lesson was simple and terrifying. Danger doesn't always look like danger, and sometimes it's sitting across from you, smiling on Valentine's Day. I left the parking area just as the sun was dipping behind the ridges of the White Mountains, its last pale light catching the tops of the bare maples and pines. The air was sharp and cold, the kind that made your lungs sting if you took too deep a breath, and the snow beneath my boots crunched with every step. I had parked near a small, unsigned trailhead I'd found on an old hiking forum, the kind of place most people wouldn't notice. I told myself I needed the solitude. After the breakup, after the endless messages and calls that led nowhere, I just wanted to walk, to feel the cold and the quiet press against me, and to push the thoughts out of my head with each step. The trail started narrow, almost hidden beneath overhanging branches, heavy with frost. My boots sank slightly with every step, leaving a thin, uneven imprint in the hard-packed snow. It wound along a ridge at first, then sloped down toward a small stream, half frozen, glinting silver in the fading light. I paused for a moment near a patch of ice, watching it crack faintly under the weight of a stray branch someone else had left behind. The sound echoed in the stillness, sharper than it should have been, and I shivered, not from the cold, but from the sudden sense of isolation. I kept moving, pressing along the narrow path toward the waterfall I had seen in the photos online, a frozen cascade that looked like it had grown straight from the snow and ice. By the time I reached the waterfall, the last of the sunlight had vanished behind the ridges, leaving the forest in a deep, fading gray. The ice hung from the cliff in long, jagged sheets, catching what little light remained and glinting like broken glass. I stepped closer, drawn to the hollow echo of the stream behind the ice, and noticed how silent everything had become. No birds, no wind through the trees, nothing but the occasional drip of melting ice. It was quiet enough that I could hear my own breathing, loud and sharp in the empty forest. That's when I thought I saw something move. A shadow darted between the trees, low and fast, disappearing behind a thick trunk before I could focus on it. I froze, telling myself it was a deer or a fox, something small and harmless. I waited, scanning the area carefully, and finally shook my head, forcing my legs to move again. I didn't want to linger, even though part of me wanted to see the animal. I kept my pace steady, following the trail back toward where I had parked, but something in the air felt off. The snow beneath my boots suddenly seemed louder, every crunch echoing unnaturally in the empty woods. My chest tightened, and I realized I was holding my breath without noticing. Then I saw them. Footprints in the snow. They weren't human, or at least not normal. They were enormous, far larger than mine or any boot I had, deep and uneven, pressed hard into the snow. The spacing between them was irregular, not like someone walking or running in a steady rhythm. My stomach dropped. I stopped, squinting into the shadows between the trees, tracing the path back toward the waterfall. The prints were fresh. They were moving in the same direction I was heading. Whoever, or whatever, had made them was following me. I started walking faster, trying not to make too much noise, my breath rising in visible clouds in the frigid air. I felt a prickle of panic at the base of my neck, and I could almost hear my own pulse in my ears. Then the sound came. A crunch of snow that didn't match mine, heavier, closer. I turned my head briefly, catching a glimpse of movement just beyond the trees. It was quick, almost too fast to see, but I saw a dark shape, broad and low, moving between the trunks. My mind told me to stay calm, to rationalize it, but the shape didn't behave like a person. There was no human gait, no steady stride, just this shifting, uneven presence, like it was gliding over the snow, silent except for the thuds that followed my steps. I started to run. My boots slipped over the icy patches, and I fell once, catching myself on my hands and knees, scraping my palms and tearing my jacket on the rough bark of a pine. The sound of snow crunching behind me grew louder, faster, heavier. My lungs burned from the cold and the panic, and I forced my legs to keep moving, zigzagging through the trees in case it was easier to lose whoever was behind me. But every time I looked back, I caught the same impression. A dark silhouette standing just at the edge of the tree line, enormous, rigid, watching. It didn't move when I ran. It just waited, like it had all the time in the world, like it knew I would panic and stumble. I tried not to scream, tried to control my breathing, but the cold air and terror made it impossible. My thoughts raced wildly. Someone lost in the woods, some predator bigger than me, some person with malice in their eyes. I didn't want to imagine what they could do if they caught up. My stomach churned as I pushed past branches, stumbled over roots hidden beneath the snow, and tried to keep sight of the main road I knew lay ahead. I had parked near a curve in the road not far from the trail, and I just had to reach it. Finally, after what felt like hours, though it could only have been minutes, the trees began to thin. The snow on the ground became smoother, undisturbed, and I recognized the faint gravel edge of the road. Relief washed over me, a raw, physical thing that made my legs weak, but I forced them to keep moving. I stumbled onto the shoulder of the road, gasping, scraping ice off my palms and knees, my jacket torn and wet. I looked back through the tree line. The silhouette was still there, completely still, darker than the snow and shadow around it, like it was carved from the night itself. It didn't follow me onto the road. It didn't move. It simply waited, still and watching, until I got into the warmth and light of my car. I sat inside for a long time, the heat washing over me, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I fumbled to lock the doors. I could see my reflection in the windows, pale and sweaty, and I realized my breath was still misting in the car. I didn't turn the engine over for a while, just sat there, staring at the black line of trees, listening for the crunch of snow that never came. Eventually, I drove away slowly, eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, never letting the tree lean out of sight until the road bent sharply and the forest receded behind me. Even then, I couldn't shake the memory of that figure, impossibly large, standing silent in the shadows, and I kept checking the side mirrors well into the next town. I didn't tell anyone, didn't post online, didn't call friends. I knew what I had seen, and I knew the forest could hide far more than I could ever imagine. The snow would cover footprints, the dark would swallow shapes, and the quiet would keep secrets. I never went back to that trail. I never will. I arrived at the restaurant early, my car idling in the quiet parking lot while I tried to calm the tight coil of nerves in my stomach. The air outside was cool, dry, and still, the streets nearly empty on a Friday evening in Tucson. I watched people pass in small groups, couples holding hands and laughing, and felt an odd mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Valentine's Day always had a weight to it, a sense that something was expected, even when it wasn't clear what that should be. I had met her online a few weeks ago, messages traded carefully, the kind of cautious familiarity that slowly built into curiosity. She seemed smart, thoughtful, easy to talk to, and when we agreed to meet in person, I felt the careful thrill of crossing that boundary between the digital and the real. The restaurant was tucked between a row of small shops, its exterior understated, a simple sign in faded red letters above the door. I stepped inside, and the warmth hit me immediately, carrying the scent of garlic and baked bread, soft enough to be comforting rather than cloying. The dining room was small, intimate, dimly lit by low-hanging lights and scattered candles. A violin played somewhere near the corner, low and slow, the notes curling around the tables. It should have felt romantic, welcoming, a place where the night could start gently. I sat at our reserved table, fidgeting with the edge of the napkin, glancing at the doorway every few seconds. My phone buzzed with a short text. She would be late. I exhaled and tried to let my nerves settle. That's when I noticed him. Across the room, at a table that shouldn't have been occupied, a man sat alone. He was older, thin, wearing a dark jacket that hung loosely on his shoulders. He didn't move, didn't glance at anyone else. His attention was entirely on me. The way he looked, though subtle at first, began to make my chest tighten. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, that maybe he was just staring vaguely in my direction. But the gaze was steady, patient, like a lens focused on every small motion I made. I looked away, pretending to examine the menu, and when I returned my eyes, he was still there, still watching. Minutes passed, and I felt the tension in my stomach coil tighter. I told myself it was nothing, just nerves, and focused on the pattern of light on the tablecloth, the faint reflection of the candles on the glasses. The restaurant was quiet, the sound of the violin filling the small pauses between the muted clink of silverware. When I finally stood to use the restroom, I moved slowly, deliberately, keeping my posture casual. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him lean slightly forward, scribbling in a small notebook. I didn't want to look directly, but the movement was deliberate, almost methodical, and it carried a weight I couldn't explain. I brushed it off, telling myself that perhaps he was a writer, a man who liked to take notes while he observed life around him. The restroom was cool, stark, a contrast to the warmth of the dining room. I washed my hands, feeling the tension in my shoulders tighten with every second I spent away from the table. Something in the air felt wrong, and I couldn't shake it. Returning to the table, I expected to slide back into the rhythm of the evening, to wait and hope that the rest of the night would unfold normally. But when I arrived, the table across from me was empty. No one had ever been there. The waiter approached, calm but professional. His eyes flicked briefly to the empty chair, then back to me. He explained that no one had been seated at that table, that it had been clear the entire evening. I felt the color drain from my face. My hands, still slightly damp from washing, pressed against the edge of the table, trying to steady the sudden rush of adrenaline. I said nothing, nodded mutely, and collected my coat. I left the restaurant quickly, moving through the dark parking lot with a sense of urgency that bordered on panic. The streets were quiet outside, the shadows of the buildings stretching long under the streetlights. My car was parked a few spaces away, and I hurried toward it, glancing around despite the emptiness. I slid into the driver's seat, locking the doors immediately, my chest pounding so loudly it seemed audible in the small cabin of the car. That's when I saw it, a small folded note tucked beneath the windshield wiper. My hands shook as I picked it up, unfolding the paper carefully. The message was brief, almost unnervingly precise. You belong here. Don't make me wait. I didn't stay to think about who had written it, or how long it had been there. I started the car and drove away, the engine loud in the empty streets. The warmth of the interior felt suffocating, my mind replaying the image of the man in the restaurant, the notebook, the steady gaze. It wasn't a dream, wasn't some trick of the light. Every detail was etched into my memory. I drove in silence, the note crumpled in my pocket, until I reached the familiar streets of my apartment complex. I parked, breathing hard, and made sure every door was locked, the lights on, and yet the feeling of being watched clung to me long after. I never returned to that restaurant. Days later, I thought about calling the police, about filing a report, but there was nothing concrete, no evidence beyond my own account. The thought of seeing him again, of facing that calm, methodical gaze, was unbearable. The image stayed with me, recurring in quiet moments, the empty table, the notebook, the note on the windshield. Even now, years later, I can picture the restaurant as clearly as I did that night. The soft violin, the low lighting, the man sitting still as if he had always belonged there waiting. I learned painfully that some encounters linger not because they are violent or loud, but because they are precise, intimate, and unavoidable. The memory is a quiet terror, a reminder that proximity is enough to unsettle, and that sometimes danger is defined not by what happens, but by what could happen, silently and deliberately, while the rest of the world continues unaware. I carry the note with me, folded carefully in a drawer, a silent testament to that evening. Every Valentine since, I avoid crowded restaurants, dim lighting, and the idea that someone could be observing, waiting. The lesson is simple but clear. The world is full of people who notice more than you realize, who track more closely than you think, and once that awareness exists, it never fully leaves. I survived that night, and yet, in surviving, I learned that some experiences are permanent, not because of the action, but because of the precision of the observation and the patience of the person who does it. It was an ordinary evening, entirely believable, and yet it became a story that I carry, a reminder that danger does not always announce itself loudly, and that some people watch quietly until it is too late. I remember walking into the fraternity house that night, the smell of cheap beer and pizza thick in the air. The room was packed with people wearing shades of red, pink, and white, laughing, dancing, and holding plastic cups. The lights were dim, but colored bulbs cast shifting shadows on the walls, making everything feel slightly unreal. I didn't know half the people there, but I had friends scattered through the crowd. I moved between them, feeling the pulse of music and chatter, trying to shake off the sense of loneliness that had followed me all week. I stayed with a group for a while, holding my drink and pretending I was part of the rhythm, but after a while the noise became oppressive. I needed air. I stepped out through the back door, the sudden cold hitting me like a wall. Snow had started earlier that evening, a light dusting that covered the walkways and roof in a thin, sparkling blanket. The crisp air burned my cheeks, and I drew my jacket tighter, stepping onto the concrete pad behind the house. The music thumped faintly through the walls, muffled but constant. I leaned against the railing, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness, trying to pull myself out of the haze of lights and noise inside. That's when I saw it, a shadow on the roof. At first, I thought it was a trick of the flickering lights, a cloud passing in front of the street lamps, or the reflection of someone moving inside the upper windows. My stomach tightened, a subtle pulse of unease crawling up my spine. I squinted, following the movement. It wasn't large, but it was deliberate. Low and careful, crouched near the edge of the roofline. I froze. My first instinct was to laugh at myself, to think maybe it was just a bird or some loose tarp shifting in the wind. The wind was light, but it carried the distant sounds of the party, muffled but alive. I blinked, and the shadow shifted again, moving closer to the gutter, stopping like it was scanning the yard below. Then I heard the tapping. Soft at first, almost dismissible. Faint metal on metal, coming from the vents that ran along the exterior wall near the back door. One tap, pause, two taps, pause. It had a rhythm, deliberate and precise, like someone testing the metal to see how it would respond. My heart jumped. My stomach nodded. I took a small step back and tried to listen closer, and the tapping moved, sliding across the metal vent in a slow, deliberate crawl, echoing softly in the night. The sound shifted closer to the windows that faced the yard. I could feel my pulse in my ears, in my fingertips. I glanced back toward the party. The lights inside cast silhouettes through the blinds, people moving, oblivious. They couldn't see me out here, and they certainly wouldn't hear what I was hearing. I took another step back, and my hand brushed the door handle. It didn't move. The door was locked. My stomach dropped. I had gone out thinking I could step back inside if it got cold, or if I just wanted a moment to breathe, but now the door wouldn't budge. I rattled it softly at first, then harder. Nothing. The tapping on the vent paused. I froze, the night stretching out in silence, punctuated only by the muffled bass of the party and my own shallow breaths. My mind raced, imagining someone just outside, someone patient, waiting for the right moment. I edged toward the side yard, ducking low behind a bush near the corner of the house. The snow crunched softly under my shoes, and I worried it might give me away, but the sound was minimal. My hands were trembling, and I fumbled for my phone. I had to call someone. I had to let someone know I was here. My fingers slipped over the screen, dialing 911 before I could overthink it. The call connected, and I whispered my location as quietly as I could, my voice cracking when I tried to explain what I'd seen. The operator stayed calm, asking questions, and I gave them everything I knew. The shadow on the roof, the tapping, the locked door, the footprints in the snow I hadn't noticed until I looked down. They told me to stay hidden, that police were on the way. While I waited, I tried to observe. The shadow hadn't moved since I ducked behind the bush. The vents were silent. I strained my ears against the wind and music, trying to make sense of it all. Then I saw something else, marks on the siding near the corner of the roof. Deep scratches, as though something had dug claws or hands into the wood. They were too precise to be random, jagged and uneven in a pattern that made my skin crawl. My mind struggled to rationalize it, trying to tell me it was a branch scraping in the wind, a bird, anything safe. But it wasn't. I knew it. Footprints in the fresh snow caught my attention next. They led away from the side of the house, partially covered by light drifting snow, but clear enough to see the outline of heavy boots. Oddly, the prints were uneven, like whoever left them was moving carefully, deliberately choosing where to place each step. They didn't lead toward the street or any other logical path. They went into the dark fringe of trees along the property line, disappearing into shadows. Time stretched painfully. I could feel every heartbeat, each one loud in my chest. I tried to focus on breathing, forcing myself to slow down, telling myself I wasn't trapped, that someone was coming. The wind shifted, carrying a faint smell, something metallic, coppery, like iron or blood. My stomach twisted, though I wasn't sure why. I hadn't seen anything like it, hadn't touched anything, but it was there. A movement on the roofline jerked my attention. The shadow shifted, crouched lower, just visible against the dark shingles. I thought of climbing inside through a window, but every path seemed blocked. The house was a fortress of doors that wouldn't open, windows that were too high or too narrow, and the party's laughter was a distant, meaningless comfort. I could see people moving inside, carrying cups, laughing at jokes I wouldn't hear, unaware that someone had been outside, watching them, testing their defenses without ever entering the room. When the police arrived, the flashing lights cut through the dark. The shadow disappeared instantly, slipping into the night without a trace. Officers checked the roof, the vents, and the yard. They followed the footprints into the trees, but they ended after a short distance, like whoever had left them vanished into the woods. They found the scratches, the claw-like marks along the siding. No explanation, no suspect, nothing concrete to hold on to. I stayed in the house with the officers for a while, shaken, unable to feel safe. My friends were curious about why I was pale and trembling, but I couldn't explain it in a way that would make sense. There was no one to point to, no obvious threat, only the memory of being watched, of someone patient and calculating, taking the time to study the house, the people inside, and me outside, completely alone. In the following days, I kept thinking about the prints in the snow and the marks on the siding. I kept imagining the tapping sound moving across the vent, precise and deliberate. The image of the shadow crouched along the roofline wouldn't leave me. I checked the locks on my doors obsessively, made sure no one could get in, and found myself waking at odd hours to look outside, convinced I'd see the same movements again. Months later, I walked past the fraternity house during the day. The scratches were still there, faint but visible, a reminder of that night. The snow had long melted, and there were no footprints, no shadow, nothing but the marks left behind on the building itself. I realized that whoever had been there had chosen me to notice, had allowed me to survive, and had disappeared without confrontation. It wasn't about fear for them. It was about control, about patience and precision. That Valentine's Day, what had started as a celebration, ended with a stark, unshakable lesson in vigilance. I understood for the first time what it meant to be watched and measured, and how quickly normal life could turn into a waiting game with someone who moved unseen, deliberate, and calm. The house felt different after that night. I couldn't walk past it without glancing at the roof, the vents, and the corners where shadows pooled. I knew the marks weren't random, and the footprints weren't mistakes. Whoever had been there had been methodical, intentional, and utterly real. Every time I think back to that night, I can feel the cold concrete under my hands, the snow under my shoes, the tap-tap-tap along the vent echoing faintly in my mind. I can see the shadow crouched on the roof, patient, calculating, just out of reach. And I know that while the cops never found a suspect, while the party continued obliviously, and while life eventually returned to normal in every other sense, the memory of being measured, watched, and hunted that night remains. It's a weight I carry quietly, a reminder that danger doesn't always announce itself, and that sometimes the most terrifying threats are the ones you never see, only feel. I never went back to another Valentine's party at that house. I didn't need to. I already knew what the night had left behind. Marks, footprints, and the certainty that someone had been there, someone patient enough to watch, deliberate enough to wait, and skilled enough to vanish without leaving anything but evidence of their presence. I understood, finally, what it meant to survive purely by being unnoticed, to feel relief only after the lights came, and to know that the world could shift on a single night in ways I would never forget. That night, the house, the shadow, the tapping, all of it became part of me, a memory precise, terrifying, and completely undeniably real. It was over, and I was alive. That's all I could take from it, the only satisfaction in an otherwise endless night of fear. I survived, I saw it, I remembered every detail, and no one could take that reality from me. The roof, the scratches, the footprints, and the tapping, the evidence remained. I didn't need to understand why. I only needed to know that I had escaped, and in that, there was a finality I could hold on to. It never returned, and the cops never found the person. The house never seemed the same, and neither did I. I learned that some dangers aren't confrontational. They watch, they wait, and they move on when they've had their fill of observation. And that, more than anything else, was what made that Valentine's Day unforgettable. The fear, the calculation, and the awareness that someone had measured every second of that night left a mark on me far deeper than any scratches on siding or footprints in the snow ever could. I carried it with me every day, in every locked door, in every cautious glance over my shoulder, in every quiet moment when the world seemed normal and safe, but I knew it wasn't.